So yeah, welcome everybody, and thanks again for waiting there. This is the autumn series of planning for citizen participation in Mission Ocean and Waters. Some of you might be coming back from the springtime, in which case welcome back, and some of you might be joining us anew, in which case welcome. I'll give a brief introduction now for the next couple of minutes and just contextualize this in terms of Mission Ocean and Waters itself. Before I pass you on to our esteemed facilitator, who I'll introduce properly in a second. In the name of time saving, I had just prepared a brief Slido, but we won't go into that right now. Instead, we'll just go straight through to the content. So just briefly, and then for the purpose of the recordings, for anyone who isn't aware, this is a webinar series designed to support citizen participation in Mission Ocean. And Mission Ocean is one of the 5 EU missions, soon to be 6. The others are Mission Climate, Cancer, Smart Cities, Soil, and the new European Bauhaus is a new sustainable design mission that's recently been announced. And the missions themselves are, like, the idea behind them is it's an effort to move across the, like in the EU and at the EU Commission level, from a sector-based to challenge-based policy thinking. So if you think of what it might take to restore European oceans and waters, it's, you know, instead of thinking about this in kind of a siloed or project-based or piecemeal way, as, you know, oh, well, we might need, you know, technology to clean up plastic and we need knowledge around restoration. Instead, the idea is to think of, okay, no, what we need is restored ocean and waters. And, you know, that kind of overarching end goal, and the technology and the innovation and the practices, the social practices, will follow to get there. So they have very ambitious goals to be delivered by 2030. Just to give you a bit of an idea of where we're, again, the exact context we're acting in, Mission Ocean is 3 overarching objectives in terms of protecting and restoring, preventing and eliminating pollution, and making the blue economy carbon neutral and circular. And under that, it's got a group of target outcomes in terms of citizen and stakeholder engagement. So of any of us who are working on Mission Ocean projects or want to be working on Mission Ocean projects, or indeed on any kind of aquatic initiatives in the EU over the coming period, if you're engaging with citizens, these are some of the areas that you'll have to be engaging with. And this is the kind of overarching policy area that you're working in. So just before I introduce our facilitator for today and our specific subject of community-based social marketing, I might just point out that in the baseline study done for Mission Ocean last year, in the summary of their chapter on citizen engagement, they ended with marine environments are intrinsically complex and embedded in dynamic socio-ecological systems. Therefore, overlooking the human and social dimensions of the ocean is one of the most common factors behind conservation failure. This highlights the urgent need for actions that enhance people's understanding of, connection to, and resulting pro-environmental attitudes and behaviours towards the ocean. So what we want to do today is we want to help anyone who wants to design a project to be able to engage with this lack and engage with changing people's behaviours to do that properly. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed facilitator for today, Dr. Doug Mackenzie-Moore. Dr. Mackenzie-Moore has worked for over 4 decades to incorporate scientific knowledge and behaviour change into the design and delivery of environmental programmes. He's the founder of community-based social marketing itself, a framework for developing environmental behaviour change programmes, which is now used globally. Doug's also the author or co-author of 3 books on community-based social marketing, and fostering sustainable behaviour. One of them has been recommended by Time magazine. So on that, Doug, just like to thank you again for being with us today, and sorry about the confusion there. And please, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for some of you. Apologies about the delay in getting started. I want to begin this afternoon by telling you a story that'll set the stage for everything else that I'm going to discuss with you. I grew up in Winnipeg, and for those of you less familiar with the geography of Canada, Winnipeg's in the prairies. It's one of the coldest places you can possibly imagine on the face of the planet. I did my undergraduate degree in psychology there, and then I moved to southern Ontario. And the most southern tip of southern Ontario is literally at the same latitude as Northern California, did my graduate work there. I taught for 5 years at a university in Southern Ontario. And then in 1993, my wife and I and our two very young daughters moved from Southern Ontario out to Atlantic Canada, where we've lived until relatively recently. We now live on the west coast of Canada rather than the east coast of Canada. For obvious reasons, when we moved our home, we did not move our composter. And one of the very first things I did after we set up our first house is I went and purchased a new composter, or brought it back home, set it up, went into the house and said to my wife, "Where do you think we should put this in our backyard?" And my wife, her name is Sue, Sue and I are having this conversation in our kitchen looking out on our very long, narrow backyard. And my wife says to me, "Why don't you put it back there?" And the back there that she's pointing at is this bush that's just strategically larger than the size of a composter. So if you put the composter back behind this bush, looking out any of the back windows of our first home in Fredericton, you won't see the thing. And that seemed like a good idea. And I want to stress the word seemed. So this is summer of 1993, and we compost through July, August, September, October, November, and then it begins to snow. And it begins to snow like nothing I have ever seen in my life before. Now, prior to the pandemic, I strategically left Canada in the middle of the winter. So just to give you a sense of how much snowfall we would get, I would leave and I would go to Hawaii, and then I would usually go to Australia, and then I would go to New Zealand in the middle of our winter, which meant that my wife was home alone to look after the amount of snowfall that we were getting. So 2 years before the pandemic began, I was in Perth, Western Australia. I've been away for about 6 weeks, and I get this email from my wife saying in the subject line, "Time to come home!" exclamation mark. There's no content in the email. There's none of "I'm missing you, looking forward to coming home." There's just this picture attached. This is the picture of the front of our home. Now, this means that my wife and my two daughters are home alone, basically looking after this. Literally a nanosecond after this first email, I get a second email from her. And in the second email, the subject line says, "Time to come home, comma, I really mean it." 3 exclamation marks this time rather than one. And there's a picture, because we had a corner lot, of the stop sign at the corner of our lot. Here's the stop sign. And the snow is almost covering the stop sign. Now, coming back to the first winter in 1993, I don't know this because the university I took the position at strategically hired people during the warmer months because they knew no one would relocate to Atlantic Canada if they actually knew the amount of snowfall and how long the winters were. So that first winter, I would shovel off our driveway, I'd shovel off the pathway to the front door and the side door, go behind the house, and shovel this pathway out to this composter that I stupidly put at the end of this long, narrow backyard. And I remember one day coming back from work and the snow is up, though snow is up to my waist. And rather than shoveling out this pathway to the back of composter, I go in the house and announce to my wife, "That's it. For the remainder of this first winter, those organics are going to end up at the curbside rather than the back of composter." So why am I starting off this presentation by telling this story? Because everyone on this call, like myself, is relatively knowledgeable about sustainability issues. But none of us, literally none of us, consistently engage in all the actions that you and I need to move us forward to a more sustainable future. And if that's true of the people who design and deliver programs to bring about sustainability, then it is going to be doubly or triply true, if triply is a word, for the people who we are delivering programs to. Those people, for the most part, are much less knowledgeable. They're much less motivated on sustainability issues, but those are the people that you and I need to nonetheless get them to change the behavior. So in this brief presentation today, I'm going to discuss with you knowledge from the behavioral sciences and how it can be applied to think about bringing about changes in behavior because they're critical to the work that you want to do with respect to oceans and rivers. If we can't get people to engage in reducing litter, reducing fertilizer use, reducing pesticide use, etc., making sure the nets are properly maintained, if we can't do all of those things, then we can't get to where we wish to go. But I want to start this morning by letting you know that unfortunately, the vast majority of programs that we deliver today are ineffectual in changing behavior. And I want to just be frank with you about what environmental psychologists are. I'm an environmental psychologist by training, know about the kinds of programs that we presently deliver. So the vast majority of programs that are out there today are described by psychologists as being information intensive. And if I had to guess, I would guess that more than 80% of all the programs in the EU, all the programs in North America, in the West, are information intensive in their nature, which means that we make use of radio, television, the internet, and newsprint and social media to push information to people with the hope that providing them with that information is going to change their behavior. And all of those programs are based upon the simple premise that if people simply knew more and cared more, they would change their behavior. All of the programs are based upon that simple premise. But what we know is that the vast majority of those programs, even if they change knowledge and change attitudes, don't effectively change behavior. So let me show you just a couple quick examples of this. You can find many more examples in the first chapter of my book. And again, the title of that book is Fostering Sustainable Behavior. So this is a program that focused specifically on reducing fertilizer use. One of the things that many of you are working on is a way to be able to protect rivers and oceans. This is from the Chesapeake Bay area. So this is a well-researched project in which they're looking at trying to reduce fertilizer use in the area around Washington, D.C. Now, what do they know about this area? They know that when they look at fertilizer use, there's some 4,700,000 pounds of nitrogen that make their way into the bay every year, 14% of which comes from residential sources. When they look at phosphorus, as you can see on the screen, there's a little over 500,000 pounds that make their way in the bay on an annual basis, and 8% of that comes from residential sources. Now, this was a massively expensive campaign that wanted to do one simple thing. They're not asking people to stop using fertilizer use. They're asking them instead to switch from springtime to fall usage. Why? Almost all the rainfall in the northeast of North America, the continent, comes in the springtime. So if people are fertilizing the lawns in the springtime, there's a high likelihood that the fertilizer will simply wash off their lawns, get into the storm drains, contaminate local rivers, and then finally contaminate the ocean through the Chesapeake Bay. So they're asking people simply to switch from spring fertilization to fall fertilization to reduce the likelihood of that contamination. They spent $550,000 just on this one campaign for this large metropolitan area. Let me show you some of the materials. Most of the money was spent running this advertisement. I'll run the ad for you.
Spring rains in the D.C. area carry excess fertilizer to our sewers and rivers. It travels to the Chesapeake Bay where blue crabs have been rapidly disappearing. They suffocate slowly from lack of oxygen. No crab should die like this. They should perish in some hot, tasty, melted butter. So hold off on the fertilizer until fall, because ridding the planet of delicious backfin is just plain wrong.
Now, I'm not sure if all of you caught the tagline there at the end of that ad, but the tagline was "Save the crabs, then eat them." I don't know of any conservation-related program whose sole focus was human consumption. That conservation ought to be based upon this idea of human consumption. But it was humorous, and they made use of a whole bunch of other humorous collateral materials in order to get this messages across. They had advertisements in magazines, newspapers, coasters in restaurants and bars, and here's my favorite ad: protect the crab cake population. But having a campaign that's humorous does not necessarily mean it's working to change behavior. So how did they go about evaluating this campaign? Well, they did what many of us do. They surveyed people over the phone to find out if they're familiar with their campaign. And they broke people into two groups, those who were familiar and those who were not familiar. For those who were familiar with the campaign, they were simply asking them, can you tell us what the tagline was? And if people could tell them what the tagline was, they clearly were familiar with the campaign. And you can see that they had a high level of recognition. 72% of people knew about this campaign when they called them up and asked them. So they're getting really high penetration in the community, but does that mean that they're actually changing behavior? Now, one of the things I want to highlight for you is that if you're evaluating your campaigns based upon self-reports, be careful about that. When people know that they ought to be doing something, that the very high likelihood that they will self-report that they are engaged in that behavior or engaged in that behavior more frequently than people who are not familiar with a campaign. So be very careful about assuming that self-reports that look positive for you are actually true in terms of actual data. So let me show you the actual results of this program. So again, this is an information-intensive campaign, and I'm showing this to you because all of us that are on this call ought to be cautious about simply providing information in terms of trying to change attitudes and knowledge and bring about changes in behavior. For those people who are not familiar with the campaign, this is a percentage of 46% who were still fertilizing their lawns in the springtime. You spend $550,000 American delivering this campaign, and you get absolutely nothing in terms of change in behavior. And this is frequently referred to as one of the most effective campaigns in the United States to reduce fertilizer use. It had no statistical impact upon actual changes in behavior. Right? So that's the first example. Second example is much briefer. This is a water use handbook in which one community in the United States spent $50,000 producing a handbook and distributing it to households throughout the community. But what was unique about this campaign is that only half the community received it and the other half did not. Every household was individually water metered so they could look at water consumption before and water consumption afterwards. So let's just imagine for a moment that Sarah and David, the two of you, live right beside each other. And just by chance, David, you receive this handbook, and Sarah, you do not receive the handbook, right? Just by chance. When we do that with large enough numbers, we're making our groups functionally equivalent to one another. So any differences we see in behavior have to be due to the program that we delivered rather than pre-existing differences between groups. So what impact did this campaign have upon people's water reductions? The answer is absolutely none. And we see this finding again and again and again in the literature. If in your own programs, all you are doing is providing information, the likelihood that you are actually changing behavior is unfortunately remarkably remote. So last example, littering, because I know littering is obviously very important in terms of thinking about plastic and other items that might get into the ocean. This is a survey that was done with 500 people in which people are individually interviewed and asked about their responsibility for littering. 94% admit responsibility. So let's imagine, Sarah, that you're in my office and I'm conducting this survey with you, and I'm asking about a whole series of environmental attitudes and behaviors. And one of the questions embedded in this is, do you feel responsible for picking up litter? And David, you're a Confederate who's working along with me. And while the door to my office is closed and Sarah's being interviewed, you come along and plant a piece of litter just directly outside the door. And the question is, will Sarah and others pick it up? Again, this is what happens for 500 people. 94% admit responsibility and 2% pick it up. So if people's attitudes are importantly related to behavior, we'd expect those numbers to really be highly correlated, and they're not. And that's what we see in the general literature. In fact, to review the literature, environmental psychologists, and particularly Andrew Darton, said the following: at least 80% of the factors that influence pro-environmental behaviors do not stem from knowledge or awareness. So knowledge awareness means that when we're trying to educate people to get them to change their behavior, the vast majority of what's actually causing people to change their behavior on sustainability related issues has nothing to do with changing knowledge or awareness. But the vast majority of programs out there in Europe as well as in Canada only try to focus on raising levels of education. We need to do far more if we're going to protect our oceans and rivers. So, having depressed you in the beginning part of this presentation, I want to talk with you for the remainder about an approach that you might think about utilizing in your own programs. As David suggested, I'm the founder of Community Social Marketing, and this is an approach that I've been talking about for about 3 decades now. And while it may be new for most of you who are on this call, this is an approach that's used extensively in the United States and Canada, in England, in Ireland, in Australia and New Zealand, and a number of Asian countries as well. Much less used in the European Union. For many of you, this will be a new introduction. CBSM, which is what most people call it, is based, as you can see on the screen, on 5 behaviors. The first of those behaviors is very, very careful selection of which behaviors to go after. So if you think about single-use plastics, the question we'd be asking is, well, what single-use plastics are most important for us to focus on in terms of trying to protect the oceans? There's a long list of single-use plastics we could go after. What we're trying to do initially is cull that list down to the most important behaviors for us to go after first, right? The second step is, once we've uncovered what those behaviors are, the second step is to uncover the barriers that preclude people from engaging in each of those actions and what would motivate people. And for those of you taking notes, this is the most uncomfortable thing I will say to you today. We know conclusively now that the barriers to behavioral change are unique for each environmental action that we would like people to be involved in. So trying to reduce the use of single-use plastic bags, the barriers to that behavioral change are going to be distinctly different from getting people to use containers for bulk purchasing of food in supermarkets. Two closely related behaviors, apparently, but two very distinctly set of barriers that go along with them. And if we don't intimately understand what the barriers are to each of the behaviors that we wish to encourage, our likelihood, obviously, of developing successful programs to address them is reduced dramatically. So the barriers are known to be uniquely distinct for each of the behaviors that we'd like to go after. And that means we need to dig in. We need to understand what the barriers are in the EU for each of the different behaviors that we would like to try to foster. The flip side of this is that we need to also understand what would motivate individuals to engage in these behaviors. And it would be a mistake for this campaign or these campaigns to presume that the principal reason why people would engage in these behaviors is to protect rivers and oceans. That may be why you and I are delivering these programs, but that is not necessarily the motivation for people to engage in these behaviors. I've done a lot of work on climate change, and reducing CO2 emissions rarely comes up as a principal motivation, for example, for people to engage in actions like making their homes more residential, more energy efficient, or changing their transportation habits. People have very different reasons for why they engage in those behaviors. So similarly, when we look at ocean protection behaviors or river protection behaviors, we need to understand intimately what are the motivations. And what you might wish to jot down is motivations or benefits almost always trump barriers. If people are not motivated, stripping away the barriers to them engaging in behavior will not get you the behavioral change. People need to almost always first be motivated and then strip away the barriers and make the behavior that we wish people to be involved in something that's easy for them to do. So that's the second step, is uncovering those barriers and benefits. The third step is to develop strategies to try to address those barriers and benefits. And you'll see on the screen that's plural, it's strategies rather than strategy. Why is that the case? Because we're trying to find the most cost-effective program to bring about the behavioral change. Fourth step, we're going to pilot test different strategies against each other to find which of those most cost-effectively brings about the behavioral change. And then once we've done that, we're going to go on to the fifth step of broad-scale implementation. Now, when you look at the screen, there's no rocket science behind those 5 steps, but they're based upon 2 very clear premises. The first is the behaviors differ in their importance. And we need to understand what are the most important ocean and river protection behaviors for people to engage in before we ever think about designing programs. Secondly, the barriers and the motivations to a lesser extent are unique for each of those behaviors. So we need to know what those barriers and benefits are before we ever think about developing programs. And then finally, because it is difficult to change human behavior, even when people are highly motivated and knowledgeable, we need to pilot test our programs before we ever think about broadly implementing them. So again, as I said just a few minutes ago, this is an approach that's used extensively around the globe, not so much in the EU yet. We have literally thousands of different agencies that are utilizing this approach. I'll just give you one example. The US Department of Energy put out a report about a decade ago encouraging that all residential energy efficiency programs in the United States ought to be based upon this approach. Wales, for example, is making extensive use of CBSM around their programs around climate change. So let's dig into the first step. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how do we take a long list of ocean protection behaviors and cull it down to a shorter list of the things that we should most focus on. Now, to do this pedagogically, I'm going to use an example that's outside of the area of thinking about ocean and river protection, but to use something that all of you have intimate familiarity with, which is energy use, right? So I'm going to give you a Canadian example here. When we think about trying to determine which behaviors are most important in any area, we first want to ask ourselves, what is the contributions of different sectors to that particular issue? So when we look at this question, in Canada, industry makes up 39% of all energy use. Transportation makes up 30%. Residential sector makes up 16%. The ICI sector, so commerce and institutions, makes up 13%, and agriculture makes up a lowly 3%. Now, why is it important to start with a pie chart like this as your first step in selecting behaviors that you wish to go after in terms of ocean protection? Because we need to know intimately what are the most important sectors for us to target. Coming back to this energy example, if you targeted the agricultural sector in Canada and you delivered great energy efficiency programs, it would not matter. It's only 3% of overall energy use. So we have to be making sure, first and foremost, that we're selecting the most important sectors to target. So when we're thinking about reducing single-use plastics, we'd be creating a pie chart that'll look just like this. They'll be dividing out for different countries in the EU what's a contribution to single-use plastics, and that would begin to direct us to what sectors we need to focus on. What we do, as you can imagine, is pull out one of these sectors, and pedagogically, I'm going to pull out residential here, even though industry and transportation are higher, because all of you have familiarity with residential energy use. So when we pull out residential energy use in Canada, this is what the pie chart looks like. 60% of the energy use in Canadian homes is space heating. Now, what you might jot down in your notes for, again, those of you taking notes, when we get to the second step, and we see a large pie chart, a slice like this, what it tells us immediately is the most important behaviors have to be in that slice. They cannot be anywhere else because this slice is dominating the rest of the pie. So why is that important? Because most of you, most of the time, have a really, really long list of behaviors. And going through each of these individual slices and trying to determine which of them is most important is really challenging to do. In the area of residential energy use, there's over 240 discrete behaviors that we might actually promote. We don't want to have to investigate all 240. So a shortcut for us is to look at the slices in the pie chart and their size and say, well, where are the most important behaviors? Well, in this case, they've got to be in space heating, right? And you would see similar things in terms of looking at nutrients or chemicals or pesticides, for example, that might be making their way into rivers and oceans, in which you're trying to then determine, well, which behaviors would we go after? Here's space cooling in Canada. Here's water heating. Here's major appliances, minor appliances. And the least important thing is what we have focused on the most, which is lighting. So creating this second pie chart helps us to work out, well, which behaviors are most worthwhile for us to go after. The third task that you have is that you then break out one of the slices that you've deemed to be important, and then you're asking yourself, what's the exhaustive list of behaviors that I could go after that are related to that particular slice? And here they are. Install a high efficiency shower head, turn down the thermostat temperature so we're not keeping the water temperature so hot, install a blanket around a hot water heater, install an on-demand system so we're getting rid of our hot water heater, having people take shorter showers, washing clothes in cold water, using full dishwasher loads. Now that's not an exhaustive list, but it's illustrative of what your task for all of you is to do. Is you're trying to identify what sector is most important, and then once you've identified that sector, you're then trying to break out how does that sector contribute to the issue that I'm working on, and then you're asking yourself which behaviors map over that particular slice. So let me stress for you, what we know at this point is we've got a really relevant sector to focus on. We know within that sector the set of behaviors that are up for consideration. But what we don't know is which of those behaviors is most important to focus on. And that's the last part of this first step, step 4. The way in which we can evaluate any list of behaviors that you're going after for ocean protection is to say, first of all, well, what's the impact of that particular behavior that we might go after? And that is what everyone does. But that's where most people stop. Is they literally say, well, what's the impact of a particular behavior? And we're going to look at the impact of a whole series of different behaviors and then stop. That's a mistake. We need to look not just at impact, but we also need to look at the probability of people engaging those behaviors. So I once served as the principal advisor of the Canadian government on their climate change related programs. All of their residential sector initiatives were based upon 2 behaviors: additional insulation in people's attics and getting people to switch out inefficient furnaces with more efficient furnaces. They were the wrong two behaviors because all they were looking at was impact. They needed at the same time to be looking at what's the likelihood of people adopting those behaviors. High impact behaviors that very few people are going to do are pretty much useless to us. We need high impact behaviors that have a high probability of actually being adopted. So in your own programs, ask yourself which behaviors are of high impact in terms of ocean protection and at the same time have high probability of an actual adoption. But we need to look beyond that. There's two other characteristics to ask yourself as well. The third is, what are people currently doing? What's the adoption or penetration rate for the behaviors I'm interested in? So if you were trying to reduce water usage, for example, and you learned that most people already have high efficiency shower heads installed, that's not a very useful behavior for us to go after. So we're asking, do I have a behavior that's high in impact, high in probability of adoption, high probability of people engaging the behavior, but presently relatively low levels of adoption or penetration? And then finally, the last characteristic is we're looking at actual applicability. Right? Is this a behavior that many people, many corporations, many farmers can engage in, or is it behavior that only applies to a small number of individuals? Now, we have literally hundreds of programs now in which people are using these four characteristics to suss out first and foremost which behavior should we go after before we ever think about delivering actual programs. So if we were looking at this in terms of protection of rivers and oceans, and you're looking at trying to reduce fertilizer use, here's a list of 5 behaviors you could consider. Getting people to replace their lawn with native plants so that they're reducing pesticide and fertilizer use. Fertilizing after a particular date. In the United States, that's after Memorial Day, when most of the large rainfalls are no longer happening. Getting people to leave their grass clippings on the lawn as a source of natural fertilizer rather than fertilizing their lawns. Not fertilizing their lawn at all. And getting people to remove leaf debris and other material from gutters and from curbs as a way of reducing nutrients going into our waterways. Those are just 5 of many behaviors. But we can then look at impact, probability, penetration, applicability for those 5 behaviors and suss out which of those are most worthwhile to go after. So I've shown you a water-related example here. I don't have data, unfortunately, for a water-related example, but let me show you a CO2-related example. I served as a principal advisor for a program in Australia, particularly in Queensland, where they retrofitted 400,000 to 500,000 households across the state to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. They asked themselves first and foremost, which behaviors are most worthwhile to go after? I'm showing you just 5 different actions here. Here's the impact column. Here's the probability. This is data from a statewide survey asking about the likelihood that people engage in these actions. These are the present levels of penetration of these behaviors. And this is applicability. So I just want to give you a quick look at what this would look like as a table. What we're doing here is we're multiplying the impact, this is kilograms per household per year, times the probability of people wishing to engage in that behavior, times the inverse of penetration. So if 3% of people presently purchasing green power, it's the inverse of that, which is our green field, the number of people that we might potentially encourage, which is 97% here, times 0.82, which is the percentage of people who actually own their own home and have authority over the type of power that they're purchasing for their home. So what we can do is multiply these numbers together and come up with weights. And we can then use those weights and rank order the actual behaviors we go after. I want to strongly encourage all of you that before we ever think about delivering programs, we ought to be asking ourselves, do we have what I call in my book tier 1 behaviors? Do we have the most important behaviors to focus on? Because if we're not, we're squandering our time and our money by going after the wrong behaviors. We want the tier 1 actions first before we go after tier 2 or tier 3. That only makes sense for us to do that. Those of you who are in funding positions, we ought to only be funding programs to go after tier 1 related behaviors. It does not make sense that we're funding tier 2 or tier 3 if there are other behaviors sitting out there. Now, which behaviors are most important will obviously differ for different jurisdictions. And we can do that type of research. But in Canada, when I served as an advisor for the government of Canada, we basically said, we're funding 42 cities across the country, but we will not fund you for everything. We're going to fund you just to go after tier 1 related behaviors. And we should be doing the same thing for ocean protection programs as well. So step one, we're taking a long list of behaviors in whatever areas we're focusing on related to ocean protection and culling them down to the most important tier one actions. Step two, we're trying to cover what is it that inhibits people from engaging in those behaviors and what would they see as being beneficial. Now, remember from the introduction to CBSM, I said those barriers are remarkably distinct, and we need to understand them at the level of a particular behavioral change that we're going after. So reducing straws as a form of plastic pollution is going to be different from getting people to be using reusable shopping bags when they're shopping. Two different behaviors, even though both of those are related to single plastic reductions. So how do we go about doing barrier and benefit research? I don't have time to go into this with you in detail, but let me mention that there are four methodologies you might consider using. The first is do a literature search. Now, we've made that easy for you to do on our website. So you can go onto my website. It's simply CBSM for community-based social marketing.com. And we have thousands of academic articles where people are doing barrier and benefit research, delivering programs, etc. And you can search those databases based upon the particular behaviors you're looking at. So start with the literature first, search first. Then think about using two qualitative approaches, doing observations of people engaging or not engaging the behavior, as well as potentially doing focus groups. And when we want to run focus groups, we want to run focus groups with the people already doing the appropriate behavior and those that are not. And we want to look at differences between those two groups. What is it that distinguishes when the literature people call the doers versus the non-doers? And then finally, four, we want to use survey research to identify which of the different barriers are most important. It's common when you do a literature search and do observations and focus groups to potentially come up with 20, 30, 40 different potential barriers. They can't all be equivalently important. We can do quantitative survey research and literally work out which barriers are most important and which are literally irrelevant. That allows us then to be able to direct our resources towards delivering much more effective programs. So that's step two, is to do this barrier and benefit research. Step three is to develop strategies. And our strategies are designed specifically to target the barriers and benefits that we've uncovered in step two. So to give you some interest about the efficacy around CBSM, I'm going to show you some actual programs that I was involved in that make use of knowledge from the behavioral sciences around the design and delivery of programs. So I'm going to show you some case studies as a way of introducing you to some of that behavioral science literature and just how important that can be around designing effective programs. So this is a really, really interesting program related to reducing plastics, and in this particular case, fishing line. Now, I'm not going to get into detail about the research that was done by NOAA in the United States or the EPA, other than to say that they have good research suggesting that the entanglement of sea turtles is closely related to people fishing on shore. And when people leave that fishing line, on shore, when they've got it caught, a lure is caught, etc., and they don't try to recycle it or collect it up, that fishing line entangles nesting shoreline birds and sea turtles. So that's a background behind doing this. This is the project that I worked on with the Houston Zoo, along with a number of other partners in the Houston area. And we're looking specifically at trying to get fishers on piers and jetties to recycle that fishing line to be able to reduce plastic pollution in the oceans, and particularly its impact upon sea life. This is a very, very interesting program. So I want all of you to think about Texas, because Texas is just in every Hollywood movie, seemingly, in terms of being such an independent state in the United States, right? We're going to ask people to do something pretty obtrusive. As people are going down to fish on a particular pier, we're going to say to them, could we take a photo of you committing you to recycling your fishing line? And we're going to ask you, can we post this photo in a kiosk display? Now, we imagined ahead of time, given that this is the Lone Star State, that virtually no one would allow us to do this, right? So we did what's called a pilot to a pilot. If you do not know whether a particular part of your program is likely to work, you can break out that particular part of your program and pilot test it just very briefly to see whether it's worthwhile to include or not. So on a Saturday morning, two of the people that are working with me go down to this pier. And the 21 first people who are going to fish on that pier, they stop them and say, We're working with the Houston Zoo and the city of Houston to protect marine life, and particularly nesting shoreline birds and sea turtles. Would you be willing to make a commitment to recycle your fishing line? Here's why it's important. 19 of the 21 men that they spoke to, they were all men fishing on this pier, said yes, I'd be willing to do that, and they allowed them to take photos. We didn't know whether people would be willing to allow us to do this or not. The reason why she's going like this, of the two people who said no, they literally said to them, to the two women, I'm happy to have you take a photo of me, but I can see by looking at all the other photos that none of the other men actually have caught a fish yet. I want to be the one person who's actually holding up a fish in this actual kiosk display. So literally no one says no to this. This is a pretty obtrusive, what's called a commitment. And particularly it's called a public and durable commitment. So when we're thinking about using knowledge in the behavioral sciences, asking people to make a commitment to engage in behavior can increase the likelihood that they actually engage in the behavior. But there's a hierarchy to commitments. The weakest type of commitment is one that's just simply private. I commit to David that I'm going to do something. He's the only other person that knows this. Up from that is a commitment that's signed. Up from that is a commitment that's public. I commit to David that he can publish my name, for example, in a newsletter. But the most effective commitments are those that are public and durable. Commitments are public and durable, stick around for a long period of time, and what they do for us is they create social norms around what types of behaviors are most important. So when we're thinking about protecting oceans, for example, we're asking ourselves, well, where's this behavior occurring? Are many people engaging in this action? So think about boat launches. A boat launch is a perfect location to be able to pull together a bunch of public and durable commitments for people who are going to make sure that they are discharging their boat onshore rather than offshore, for example. There's a number of different behaviors related to ocean protection where we can use this concept of public and durable commitments grouped together to quickly give us social norms around the behavior. Now, we've done something very specific with this kiosk display. We've made the display area for the photos purposely small. Why are we doing that? Because we want to implicitly give the assumption that most people believe that this is the appropriate behavior. If we had made this kiosk display large, and by doing that, only had a few photos apparently showing up in that area, it would give people the impression that most fishers did not think that this is appropriate behavior. So this is what it looks like when it's filled in. It looks like almost everyone thinks that this is a right thing to do. We also put in place fishing line waste disposal areas on this pier, and we provided people with a reminder, a prompt that they could put onto their lure box, right? So very inexpensive behavioral change initiative, cost us literally just moments per person to talk with them and get these commitments. Here's the data. This happened just before the pandemic, so I don't have follow-up data, but I have the initial data to show you. Before we delivered the program, only 17% of fishing line was being recycled, right? After we delivered the program, this number went up to half of it was now being recycled. These numbers probably increased over time, but because of the pandemic, we were not able to do follow-ups with this. Why is it likely that they increased over time? Because social norms increase usually like as adoption occurs. When you see more and more people engaging some sustainable protective behavior, people begin to believe, oh, well, that's what I ought to do as well. And I want to stress for you, the number of behaviors that we need to encourage is so large. We cannot imagine that those behaviors are going to be adopted because of police enforcement or some type of enforcement. Usually we need to rely upon the development of social norms in our community and what's appropriate or inappropriate behavior. Last example, and then I'll ask for any questions, David, that people might have. But this is a very interesting example of the use of an information-intensive campaign versus the use of CBSM. So when you're thinking about, well, should I really give up on using information-intensive campaigns versus using CBSM? This is a very careful example of looking at the differences between the two of them, and it's relevant for water usage as well. So this is from the Greater Toronto area. So Toronto is 7.5 million people now. It's growing dramatically quickly, right? So by far the largest city in Canada. And because housing prices in the downtown core have now exceeded $1 million per household, most people who are looking to live in the Toronto area and work in the Toronto area are living in the surrounding townships, basically. And because of that, those areas are growing dramatically quickly, and they have lots of issues around water supply, right? So they have a choice between bringing more water in or taking the amount of water that's already being utilized and then spreading that through water efficiency to larger number of homes and businesses. And obviously, they would like to do the latter, but is that possible, right? So they're either going to have to bring in more water resources or they're going to have to be more water efficient. So a colleague and friend of mine, a man named Glenn Pleasance, who used to be the water efficiency coordinator for Durham Region, said, let's test the efficacy of CBSM versus using information-intensive approaches to reduce water usage. What they did is they selected 500 homes in 3 regional government areas. So 1,500 total, 500 in each of these 3 areas. They matched them based upon past water usage, and they also put a meter on the pipe that services the water needs for each of those 3 groups of 500 homes. So they could look at the water usage before they deliver the campaign and the water usage afterwards. In North York, which as the name suggests is north of Toronto, they're going to send out 2 mailings over the course of the summertime asking people to reduce their outdoor water usage. And they're going to list the behaviors that people should engage in. In contrast, in Durham Region, which is the east of Toronto, and Halton, which is to the south of Toronto, they're going to go door to door and they're going to speak to people. Now, we know from the literature in psychology that face-to-face communications are remarkably important, often in persuading people. We focus so much today on social media and other forms of media, but it turns out when we look at the literature that the vast majority of behavioral changes that people engage in come about through face-to-face conversations, often with the people we most trust, people that are called referent groups. So in this case, they're making use of these face-to-face conversations. And what they're asking people to do is to make a commitment. This is what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. This is a small static link sticker that goes in the front window of someone's home saying that they're committing themselves to reducing their outdoor water usage. And on the right-hand side, that's a prompt. Now, what do we know about prompts? Prompts need to be, this is based upon the psychological literature, as close in space and time as possible to the behavior that we actually wish to encourage. So it's going directly over the outdoor water faucet. So right when the person's thinking about turning the water on to water their lawns or gardens, they're getting this prompt, right? So face-to-face conversation plus 2 psychological components are being built into this. Look at the data here. So this is a huge data set. The observations are unobtrusive. We have no concerns about self-reports here. And I'm going to show you, first of all, North York. So that's just directly over the thumb here. So North York is the information-intensive approach, and they get a 1% reduction in outdoor water usage. In contrast, in Durham Region, where it's students going door to door, they get a 32% reduction in outdoor water usage. And in Halton Region, where it's staff going door to door, they nearly cut outdoor water usage in half to 45%. Now, we don't know if the difference between Durham and Halton is a staff versus student difference or a community difference. You literally would have to have staff go door to door in Halton and Durham, and have students go door to door in Halton to tease that out. But those are hugely different from what we're getting with the information intensive approach. Now, what you might be asking is, yeah, but that's much more expensive for us to go door to door and have these kinds of conversations than it is to use an information intensive approach. Is this really a good return on investment? So Glenn ran the numbers, and it turns out that it's far more cost effective to use CBSM than it is to build a new water treatment plant and bring more water into our communities than it is to use an information intensive approach. So the information intensive approach was so grossly ineffective, it was better for them to actually build the plant and bring more water in. But when we have an effective approach, even though it's more expensive to deliver, that turned out to be far more cost effective. Now, finally, you might be asking, what's the longevity of these findings? So Glenn continued to run that meter in Durham Region where he worked for 3 more years. Now, why 3 years? Because Canadian homes turn over on average every 7 years. And so at some point, we're no longer talking about the same group of people that this intervention would have been done with. But he maintained this at a 25 to 26% reduction with no further contact with those households. Now, you can find this case study and many more case studies on my website. Again, that's cbsm.com for those of you who are interested. So, David, I just want to finish with quick recommendations and questions and comments that people might have. So the first recommendation, tier the behaviors. We need to know, in terms of ocean protection, which behaviors are most important for us to go after. Secondly, do barrier and benefit research. Before we ever think about funding people to deliver programs, we need to know that we have the right behaviors and we have intimate knowledge about the barriers and benefits to those actions. This is why I suggest to all governmental agencies that they engage in what I call three-stage funding. The first stage is the first two steps of CBSM. Tier the behaviors and do the barrier and benefit research. Why do that first? Because it does not make a lot of sense to fund people to deliver programs unless we know we've got the right behaviors and we know something intimate about the barriers and benefits to those particular behaviors. We can't think logically about what the strategy should look like until we've done the barrier and benefit research. So first stage, do the behavior selection and then do the barrier and benefit research. That's stage one. Stage two is we're going to fund people to develop strategies and to pilot test those strategies. Why are we doing that? Because it's difficult to change behavior. We need to know that the programs that we're delivering are effective in changing behavior. And so we usually want to fund people to deliver concurrently different strategies against each other. Let's see which program is truly most effective in reducing this type of single-use plastic pollution in the oceans. And once we know that, then we go on to stage three, which is to fund people to do broad-scale implementation. This one change that I'm suggesting around funding can dramatically improve the quality of programs that we deliver because it's pragmatic. It's making sure we've got the right behaviors, we've done the barrier and benefit research before we ever think about strategy development, and then we go on to broad-scale implementation. Now, finally, and this is the last thought I'll leave you with, is that where do we insert behavioral science knowledge into this? One of the things that's increasingly happening in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, a little bit in the United Kingdom, particularly this happened with Downing Street, is that they've created what are called behavioral insights teams. And these behavioral insights teams are made up behavioral scientists who are often freely assisting governmental agencies at the local level and NGOs with that step of developing and pilot testing their strategies. So things that I've just spoken with you about in these two case studies of talking about public and durable commitments, grouping them together to be able to create social norms, etc., that flows very clearly out of behavioral science knowledge. But many people at the local level delivering programs, whether they're NGOs or governmental agencies, aren't familiar with their behavioral science knowledge. And we can often dramatically increase the efficacy of programs. I've seen cases where people are increasing the magnitude of engagement by 3 to 4-fold over what we would see otherwise by building behavioral science knowledge in. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this idea of inserting behavioral science knowledge in at that third step of helping people to design strategies and with a pilot testing them before we go on to broad-scale implementation. So questions or comments at this point? I know this is a lot to throw at people.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much, Doug. God, there's so much there. It's just such an interesting and robust methodology. And actually, we should say this is obviously kind of a 1 hour introduction to this method. Of course, Doug has mentioned his books already and his website, and he also runs much more thorough and longer courses and workshops on this. So we've linked the website into the chat, and I'll send it in the email after this. And we would encourage everybody to go on and look at it like that. There is some questions, Doug, and I think you've touched on one or two really interesting things. I think one of them, just considering our audience, is employing this method within a research project. Say European research projects often tend to be 3 to 4 years, or maybe
Right.
you doing 1 or 2 back to back. So I think one thing that you kind of said you touched on there is how you might perhaps stagger it in terms of identifying tier one behaviors, ideally in a primary project, or maybe
Right.
I'm thinking, would you see cognitive or CBSM being like one work package within a wider project, whereby you identify the tier one behaviors as a first task or something like that?
I would think it's a great question, David. I would think about first and foremost, obviously identifying what are the most important behaviors, because everything else we're doing rests upon that. And then related to that, you might, as I suggested, under stage one funding, combine it with doing bear and benefit research. So you could imagine a research project in which you're saying, well, first and foremost, let's identify the most important behaviors. And then once we've identified those, let's provide people the resources that they need to identify the barriers and benefits. Now, I want to stress related to that, David, that the barriers and benefits you should imagine could segment very much based upon the different jurisdictions that we're looking at.
Yeah.
So I've worked on a number of programs or provided advice to programs where people are saying, okay, let's do the behavior selection. So here's an example from California. California has extensive programs to have people recycle used motor oil, which has a large impact upon watersheds in the ocean, right? The barriers, though, so they know that's a tier one behavior, but the barriers could very well be distinctly different from different counties and communities across the state. And what they've literally done is they've coordinated the work at the state level, but they've drilled down to the level of different counties. And interestingly, what they've done then is they've said, okay, we now know what the barriers are to proper disposal of used motor oil in San Francisco County versus Sacramento County. So when you're developing a strategy, you have to showcase for us that the strategies you're developing are aligned with what we now know to be the barriers and motivations in your particular county. So when you're thinking about staging funding or thinking about this as different research projects, David, I think it's really critically important that we get the funding right. Because if we get the funding right, everything else is going to start to fall into place. And we start to say then, we'll fund you in second stage to develop strategies, but you have to show us that the strategies that you're actually coming up with are intimately linked to what we know the barriers to be in your area. I'll tell you a quick anecdote about that. I got once a very angry phone call from the woman who was the head of the waste reduction programs for Los Angeles County, so a huge area. She called me at supper time and she said, I can't believe that we now have to actually develop strategies specifically for proper disposal of used motor oil. We used to have full control over what those programs looked like. I came off that phone and I said to my wife, this is wonderful. You know, the California state government is literally saying your strategies for used motor oil have to be well aligned with the barriers and benefits. And if they're not, we're not going to fund you. That's exactly what we should be doing because we don't have time to squander when we're thinking about ocean protection or a whole host of other issues related to sustainability. So yes, build this into research projects, but give people the assistance that they need around strategy development. So one of the things I didn't say, David, because of our time constraints, is in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency literally dictates to a number of different counties that they have to use CBSM around groundwater protection. But where they've really failed is they've not trained people or provided assistance around them using that behavioral science knowledge. And that's unfair to say to someone in Los Angeles County, you have to develop strategies, but at the same time, not provide them with assistance or what that looks like. So let me give you one example of how we could do that well at the governmental level. In the state of Victoria, they have a state level agency. So this is Victoria, Australia. They have a state level agency called Sustainability Victoria. And what they have done is they've looked across all their line items to see the amount of money that was going out of house to hire consultants. And they use that money instead to hire eight behavioral scientists. And those behavioral scientists are available to local councils and NGOs who are actually developing the programs for free. That makes a lot of sense to me. You know, we identify the behaviors well. And we do the bear and benefit research. That's that first phase of the research project. But then we give people at the local level the assistance to actually develop strong programs and to pilot test them. And again, if we get the funding right and provide the level of assistance, I think that dramatically improve the quality of programs we're delivering.
Right.
Other questions, David?
Yeah, there's just one or two more. I might just address one, I think, because we touched on it there, but just to mention it explicitly, one of them is what are the tier one behaviors we should be targeting in Mission Ocean? I mean, I think you said, I suppose the difficulty with Mission Ocean is it's such an overarching framework and it's operating across 27 member states and countries that are sharing EU oceans and waters that really, I suppose, that requires research. It depends on the specific area, the specific context that you're working in, and the specific problem that a project is targeting. So that is the kind of thing that preliminary research in a project would have to identify.
Right, and it would involve us looking at, again, impact, probability, penetration, applicability
Right.
within any particular area. So if we're talking about single-use plastics pollution in oceans, right? We're then trying to identify, well, what sectors are most important, what behaviors within a particular sector are we focusing on, and that gives us those tier one behaviors. And again, this has got to be the starting point for any large scale initiative like this. We need to know the right behaviors for the right areas. And again, we ought not to be funding people to do whatever they wish.
Yeah.
We should be doing the background research that identifies the most critical behaviors for us to focus on, because anything else is squandering governmental funding, basically. We need to know the most important behaviors first. So what are those tier one actions?
Absolutely. Okay, well, we might leave it there. I might just wrap up with one more screen. Would you mind just stopping sharing your screen
Sure, of
for one
course.
second, Doug, just so I can share mine? And just to say thank you again, just for such an interesting presentation. And yeah, it was absolutely worth. We would encourage everybody to look further into Doug's work, and especially working on Mission Ocean projects. This, you know, these methods will really help, like exactly to first to engage with the mission and achieve its objectives by 2030.
David,
Just to say,
can I mention
sorry.
just to interrupt, sorry, because you did mention the training that I do. I do have a training workshop coming up the first week of December for anyone who's interested. It's being done at a time that would be in late afternoon, evening for anyone from the EU who's interested. So apologies for that, but you'll find that information on my website.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. No, that's very helpful. Yeah. And so it would be fantastic if anybody is interested to look up that. So just to show you while we're here, we do have another webinar coming up for our autumn series. It's on citizen assemblies and deliberative processes for Mission Ocean. This is on Tuesday, November the 7th at 9 a.m. CET. So please, if anyone who's interested, or anyone who's interested in working on a project in that area in terms of deliberative democracy or citizen assemblies, this should be very helpful. And we'll have more coming in spring 2024. So I'll send an email afterwards. Please, if you want to be kept up to date with our training and our future webinars, there's in the survey, the post-workshop survey, there's an area that you can just add your email address so that we can contact you again after this. And please, of course, follow us on social media and keep an eye on our website. But so for today, I'd just like to say thank you again to Sarah and Maura for helping with the facilitation. And thank you very much, Doug, again for joining us. And thanks to everybody. I hope you found it very, very useful, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon.